So welcome. I'm going to introduce Derrick now. He's our first speaker. Derrick Schultz is a designer and developer working at the many edges of digital books. He's a digital design and production manager at Atavist Books, a contributor to Creativist, and which is a publicly available digital tool set, the editor-in-chief of epubsecrets.com, and he's won awards from Apple, the AIGA, and Print Magazine. He's an active participant in the eProduction hashtag on Twitter, and a super smart guy. I'm happy to welcome him here. Derrick?
So I really want to talk, or at least start with an idea of what, sort of how web development has grown a lot. And this sort of mirrors my own, sort of experience of just building websites. When I started maybe 10 years ago, it was, you started by building very simple HTML, and then you learned about CSS, and you learned about JavaScript, and then you learned about PHP, and you sort of build up this tool set. So I'll quickly go through sort of a history of what I'm calling these web ages. So as I mentioned, this is really early HTML code. I didn't write this originally. This is probably 98 or something like that. But you can see everything is all in the HTML file. So they shoved colors into things. They had weird tags called font tags where you declared the font directly in the HTML file. You did things like centering wasn't done through CSS. You just added a center tag. And this was great originally because we only ever had one HTML page you always went to. It was always meant to look the same. So it was it was a simple format. But I think very quickly people realized that this is kind of a messy way to actually build a file. So very quickly after that, they created the CSS declaration, and the idea here was that your HTML was just your content. It was largely text-based. You could put an image here or there, but then the CSS was your presentation. And this actually was kind of an amazing turning point when you really think about it, because if you are from the design world, you constantly hear that content and the way it looks are sort of the same thing. They influence each other. But in the HTML world, this created this idea that content could be separate from the way it looks, meaning that you could have the same content and style it in a bunch of different ways. So if you remember, back in the day, CSS Zen Garden, where they had the same story and people did crazy things with it to present it in different ways by just using CSS. And then we took that another step further, and we said, well, okay, if the styling is separated out, we should also have interactivity separated out. So using JavaScript, we then separated the interactive elements. And this is also where we get into this thing called progressive enhancement, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But the idea is that you're basically creating all these layers, and that these layers allow you to sort of separate out different roles. And that's actually really interesting for editorial publishing practices as well, right? Because now you can have the editor who's working on the HTML content doesn't ever have to figure out what the design needs to look like. You can have a designer who's working largely in the CSS, and then you can have someone working in JavaScript doing the interactive elements. So it creates this kind of amazing part where you can have different people doing different roles without sort of butting heads with each other. Now, all this is great, but this still is just a static file. So basically, for a long time, people were just writing individual HTML files. They put them up on an FTP server, and it was, page1.html, page2.html, page3.html. And some smart person out there decided that, wow, all these pages are starting to look the same. Is there a way to sort of make them all utilize the same template without having to constantly rewrite the same code? So this is pseudo PHP, but essentially this is the idea, is that, if I am using the same template, then I can start to just assign sort of, this uses a database. So for example, all I need is a page title, and then I can output that page title in many places, or the body copy. And then this became sort of this great way of, now we've even reduced the amount of work that we have to do everywhere. And then we get into some more complicated stuff like APIs, where your content doesn't even have to be yours. It doesn't have to reside on a server, or it doesn't have to reside in your server specifically. So in this case, you could pull, this is the New York Times book review section. they have an API. So you can just go and grab their API, and you can use their data and display it any way you like. That is not the right video, but anyway, I'll just quickly talk about this. So there's this new thing out called the grid.io. Let's open this and see if this works. And this is on some other level of thing, and what they claim it is that they claim it's AI for design and development. I'll sort of let you watch the video on your own. It's a little marketing and gimmicky, but the idea here is that they're starting to apply things where they're sort of even taking people out of the equation. And the idea is that web design is being built by their AI system, which is probably just a lot of advanced filters. It's probably guessing a lot of things and applying those to how a page is built and those sort of things. But it's an interesting idea that it's taking templating to a place of where the user or the developer themselves isn't actually generating the templates themselves. A computer system is deciding a bunch of variables to create templates. So this is a new thing. They haven't even officially launched yet. But I think this is this great sort of trajectory in which we move from these very simple, sort of inefficient models and writing a lot of code by ourselves into moving to a place of where we're letting the systems and the computers do a lot more of the code base work. All right, so that was a quick introduction of the web development. Now I want to sort of apply that to ebooks. Where are we now in terms of how that works? So I think it's simple to say that the Stone Age was this Moby Pocket stuff. I remember when I first started building ebooks, which was just a couple years ago, and I was very heavily into HTML, and I took a look at this code, and I was pretty shocked. This is gaspful code. I can't even imagine that someone still thought this was okay, even as far back as 2008. I mean, I don't even know what size equals +4 means. +4 of what? That doesn't even register as a thing. You still have font tags, which we haven't used in years. They added in some custom markup, this page break thing. And the way that they're trying to do poetry down here, I have no clue how that works, but all I know is that it does work on a Kindle. So again, these early formats, which again, and there's presentation built into this thing, right? If I were to try to style this differently on a different Kindle device, I couldn't do it because all the styling is embedded here in this file. So EPUB 2 was sort of, or at least the EPUB spec was a way to sort of move us away from these custom pieces of code, and largely is a better format, right? It uses more basic HTML elements. It sort of defines the fact that you should use CSS. It gives you some other things, and obviously having an open spec that you can sort of understand, unlike that Kindle format, where you have no idea what half those things do. At least gives us a way to begin to sort of talk to each other, understand each other, understand what we're doing with each other's markup, and having a CSS file that presents it differently is great because, as I'm sure you know, ebook readers all present things differently. So if there's a way to potentially change the presentation based on that, or just change the presentation based on, let's say a person with limited sight ability wants to see this, and they want to add their own style sheet that makes the fonts a lot bigger. Things like that are just a great way. They add accessibility, and again, they sort of separate out what is the text-based content from the presentation style. So now we have the EPUB 3 spec, which is even better. It allows us to use HTML5 elements, things like sections, things like figure tags, which are all better semantics to sort of describe certain pieces. And then the EPUB spec has also added these things like EPUB type, which I know was talked about in the workshop last week, or yesterday. So we're building up this better library of tools that we have for us in the markup. And again, we also have an updated CSS spec that allows us to do, if you really care about doing drop caps or up caps, you have better CSS attributes to do those things with. And then for the first time, the EPUB 3 spec also says that you're supposed to be able to use JavaScript, which then adds a layer of interactivity that you can use, and is also going to let us do some things like check for certain attributes of a file, which gets us into progressive enhancement, which I'm really excited about, and we'll talk about more. So yeah, I mean, so this is sort of where we are now. Now the problem with this is like it's still defined and largely based on this idea that you're writing individual pieces of HTML files one by one. And certainly there are systems out there, like if you use InDesign, it's going to write a lot of this code for you. But it's still sort of based in this world of where the assumption is that the end output is an HTML file, and you're going to write this individual EPUB3 file for each one of these pieces. So this is what I'm sort of been hooked on in the past like couple years, is where's the printing press for the ebook? Where can we get to a place of where we have something that creates multiple copies of an ebook, either for different readers, based on different style of presentations, or even what's a better way to produce multiple ebooks using different titles, and that sort of thing. And I think, as you saw previously, like there is a world for that, and it's sort of the Ebook CMS. And this is largely a place where we have CMSs for websites. If you have ever used WordPress, you'll sort of see how that works. The idea is that, again, we're sort of taking the content and the bits and pieces and giving them a structure, and then saying, well, if I have 5 chapters in a book, I don't need to handwrite each one of those chapters, right? Like they're all built around the same template. So the most important thing about this is that we're beginning to look at all of our content not as individual HTML files, but as structured data. So the company I work for now, called Atavist, we do actually have a CMS, and it does produce ebooks, but I don't want to turn this into like a product demo. So I do want to say that while I'm going to show some stuff that we use here at my office, there's lots of other great products out there right now. O'Reilly has a new tool called Atlas. There's a thing called Pressbooks. There's a ton of great CMSs. So even though I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do at Atavist, I highly encourage you to check out other things, and if you decide that they're better for you, I'm not going to argue with you. Okay, so quickly, back to what a CMS really is. The biggest thing is that your data is structured, right? So now we're saying this is the chapter title, this is the chapter body, these are the pieces of media that go into my book. These are the images that go into my book. They can go anywhere, but they're defined as an image, and maybe there's a caption applied with them, and they're sort of relatable to each other. So for example, here's how I might describe the structured data of a book. This is quickly put together, but just covers a couple things. So for one of the big things is obviously metadata. So we've got book metadata, who's the author, what's the title, what's the ISBN, things like that. But then if you've worked with any of these ebook retailers, you know that they all have their own specific data things that they require, as well as different types. And I actually had one of our junior interns, I'll send this link out later, our junior developers actually went through every retailer and listed every single piece of data that they require and the format that it's in, and it was awful. I mean, there were things like applying what category this book is in, and one of them was like an open string field, and the other one was a drop-down menu. So those pieces of data can't actually be the same thing. So there's a lot of issues revolving around what does retailer-specific data look like, and how do you house it? It's actually one of the bigger issues I've seen in ebooks recently. But anyway, once you get past the metadata, then you've obviously got the meat and the guts of a book, which would be maybe defined by chapters. So you've got text content, you've got media content. Again, you've got titles, maybe subsections. This could be probably broken down into a lot of different categories. Footnotes, all these individual pieces that come together to make a book. And lastly, you've got, at least on my side, you've got a thing what I like to think of as templates, which would be a way of sort of taking these chapter pieces, taking all the individual data pieces together, and then combining them. So for example, at Atavist Books, we use the Creative system, but this was actually a way for me to create these verso pages, so they're the copyright pages essentially. Now, what was great about our system was that I never actually built this. I built this page once. I built it once in a static HTML file, and then I went in and hooked up all the pieces of data to our CMS. So for example, if we had a fiction book, there was just a checkbox in the metadata that said, do we need to add the fiction disclaimer? And if we did, we added this boilerplate fiction disclaimer. We added places for copyright. And then we went through a list of different metadata pieces. So if the book was available in print, we put in the print ISBN. If it was not in print, we skipped that and we just put in the ISBN 13. So there's a way in which you can sort of do all these various pieces without ever actually having to build the file individually. So again, this was great because I built this once, used it in every one of our titles. When we had updates to a title, it was as simple as changing it in the metadata and then going back to this page and resaving it. And it would republish it, and then I could export it out to my different ebooks, to the web, all these different pieces. So it was a great way to sort of manage what is a lot of individual little metadata pieces, but they all go into the book in the right place. So this is another thing that I'm always harping on people about, which is multiple outputs. I don't know if anyone's actually in the room has seen this, but I have a little GitHub place where I put all of my terrible ebook rendering issues, like the fact that if you put a media query in a Nook book, it's actually gonna just crash. So in there, like we've got all these different retailers that have their own e-reading devices, and they all render really pretty poorly. So one of the things that I'm like pretty passionate about is making sure that I send the right files to the right retailer, which means if I have an iBooks file, I want to give an iBooks reader the best EPUB file I can give them. And if you're on a Nook, or actually I can't, Kobo's really good now, so I can't really be mean to them. Plus we're in Canada. Nook's pretty bad. Google Play is pretty bad. So basically what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give the best version of an EPUB file to each retailer. And this is something you can do with a CMS, right? Because now if you've got individual pieces of data, you can also then go in and say, oh, well, if we're actually exporting out to this type of file, maybe I want my image markup to look like this. Or if we're on iBooks, like I can go, whole hog and like make it look really nice. So this is what our CMS does with media. This is just a quick look at what an image is built like. So we have a generic EPUB class, which just goes to our smaller retailers where we don't necessarily have device-specific recommendations for them. So here, like, I'm adding rules above and below an image just to make sure it's defined. And then I'm using a figure, which I can use in an EPUB 3. I'm doing some checking to see if the data has a caption. If it does, I add a fig caption and then put in caption content. If I don't, I just skip it. So this is a great way to, like, I don't have to go in and hand render little figure captions and those sort of things. Now for iBooks, I know that iBooks renders stuff really nicely, so I'm going to skip those HRs, and I'm just going to apply the figure. So here again, like, this is this really interesting thing where you can start to make little changes, but if you had to do these manually, you would probably spend half your life making one book for various retailers. So now we've sort of seen like all these pieces work well like for today. But what I'm actually really interested in is how a CMS can help our ebooks for tomorrow, which is as simple as saying, like, once you have all the structured data of your book content, all the presentation stuff can sort of happen as you need it. And one of the great things about a CMS and a publishing system is that, let's say iBooks changes their image spec next week to work with a new device, which they did very, very recently. Then it's as simple as changing it in the template code, your image sizes, and you can rerun 50 books in half a day and then just resubmit them. So there's a world in which like this whole thing sort of creates a book that has the potential of adapting very quickly to the changes that it needs to be oriented toward. All right, so I've mentioned progressive enhancement twice now, and I am finally going to talk about it. Progressive enhancement, one of the great things about this is this comes from the web world, And the idea was that web designers always want to use the newest tools. They want to use fun CSS3 animations like you saw at the beginning there. But not every browser is ready for those. So progressive enhancement was this idea of let's give at least bare bones content to the slowest, the oldest devices. And then when we get to another level of where a browser does support something, let's give them that. And then when we get to brand new browsers like the newest Chrome or Safari, let's give them the latest things. And it's this idea of just progressively building up what you're doing. So, again, if a book reader is reading on the oldest Kindle, they can still at least read the text, right? It might not be the prettiest thing. It might not have great drop caps. It might not have custom fonts, but you're still giving them something that they can read. Whereas maybe with iBooks, like you're giving them something where it has an audio soundtrack, it has video playing in it, it has interactive widgets. Like there's a way in which you can build one of these pieces and give each reader the experience that they sort of that their device is built for. So I'm going to show you. This is a title that we built at Atavist Books. Again, it was built on the CMS that we use, and it's called Twice Upon a Time, and it's actually a rather short piece, but does a lot of different stuff. Working with Hari Kunzru, the author, it's a story about him. He's a British writer. It's about him first moving to New York and sort of the experience of New York and its craziness and how he was able to sort of deal with all of that. But it also is sort of this piece that's a biography about this musician by the name of Moondog, who was a street musician in New York during the 50s. And he was an avant-garde composer. He was blind. He wore the craziest costumes. So it's sort of this really interesting story that weaves in different ways. And when Hari came in, we told him, we want to do something fun and interactive, and it's about Moondog, so we want to find a way to integrate his music into the thing. And he said, that's great. I'm working on a book, and it's about authors who do binaural recording. And we're like, well, what's that? And he said, well, it's a thing where you walk around a city with microphones in your ears instead of headphones, and you actually can experience the city in like 3D. So we said, okay, that sounds pretty cool. So he went out and did these recordings, and then we built this thing into this web and app story, which I'll show you now. So you'll see this story. This is for a web and app version, and the idea is that you can sort of swipe your way through things. So what you're hearing now is actually his refrigerator. And then you're actually just swiping words onto the page. And this is blending into Moondog's music. So that was just a taste of it. You can still buy this book. It's on atavist.com. So that was the web and app version, right? And I think anyone that's done ebooks will obviously look at that and be like, there's no way you can do that in ebook. And we were okay with that. We decided that if people were going to buy it from us directly, that we would give them this version. But if they really, really had to have it on iBooks or on Kindle, we would give it to them there as well. So this is actually what the version of iBooks look like. So this is iBooks on the desktop. This text here is actually all done via CSS. That's a picture of Moondog right there. Pretty wild. And in iBooks, we actually did add the audio soundtrack. We added sort of an appendix. So we license these pieces of Moondog's music. You actually can't buy these in the U.S., which was pretty amazing. So if you buy this book on iBooks for like $4, you actually get all the songs as well. So for Moondog, for people who are really into Moondog, it was like an amazing thing that they could actually get this legally. So yeah, these were just added as basic MP3s. iBooks supports audio, so we just added these as a player in the back. So we couldn't keep the soundtrack, but we were able to give iBooks users something of the experience. This is iBooks on the iPhone in the scrolling view, which is the way I prefer to read. It's the way everyone should read it. So you can see, again, we were able to keep a lot of the typographic details. We weren't able to like keep the swiping in and that sort of thing, but we were able to do some pretty interesting things with it. You know, we were able to sort of paginate things in a way on the scrolling view. Obviously, on a smaller device, we use media queries to change sort of the layout of things. And again, if you were in paginated view, it still looked rather nice, not perfect, but it worked. And then this is Kindle. So, you know, with the new KF8, you can actually do a lot of really nice layout stuff. So this is a KF8 file, and just used basic CSS to lay out this text. And here again, this is KF8. So we lost a couple of things, like there were some drop shadows here that I was doing via CSS that didn't seem to be supported in that device, so they got lost. But again, what people actually got out of it was pretty simple, or was as close of an approximation as their device would allow us to give it to them. And this was all, you know, I won't lie to you, this was still a lot of work, just because I actually was not sure of like what a lot of Kindle supported and other devices supported. But we built it into the CMS, and we added hooks and things to help us deal with some of the pagination methods and those sort of things. So now, if we were to do another story like this, it would be actually very easy because it's all built into templates and a structure for us to use. So as I mentioned, you can buy our titles on the web, and you can buy our titles in both an iOS and an Android app. And this is a wonderful side benefit of a CMS, is hooking it up to an e-commerce system is like the smallest part of actually building a CMS. And if there's one thing I've been like begging publishers to do more and more of, is to sell their own titles on the web. I mean, I think it's at this point, like obviously Amazon is not in a publisher's best interest. They're in it for Amazon, and I think if you can sell to your audience on your own website and do it in a way that's effective and gives people an even better experience than what they can get through reading a book directly purchased through Kindle, I think it's all the more power to a publisher. So yeah, so please sell your books on the web or through any other personal, like individual retail channel that you can do. You can almost read that. So the other part of having a CMS now is, as I showed you, the New York Times has an API where you can pull book reviews from their website using an API call. If you have a CMS, you can do the same thing for other people. So for example, like let's say that I wanted to give away the first chapter of my book to whoever wanted it. You could set up an API using your CMS, and people could just pull the first chapter and publish it on their web page. They could style it in whatever way they wanted to. It could look like it was their user content. So again, once you get these structured data bits managed and sort of wrangled, doing things with them is really simple. So I think a lot of people, every time you talk about ebook CMSs, they're like, well, I'm not a recipe. We don't make cookbooks, so like I don't want to do a recipe book that can combine multiple things. And I think that that's just like one potential example of like how to use structured data to like do different things with books. If you happen to work at a literary fiction place and you do a lot of short stories, who's to say you couldn't bundle up short stories in a different way, either by author or by theme, and sell those, again, directly through your website in a way that's instantly configurable for the user. There's lots of different things you can do with these different data bits once you have them under control. All right, so let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is InDesign. Obviously InDesign, if you want to think about it as this right now, is its own sort of like very weird, very idiosyncratic CMS. You could say, well, I have 50 InDesign files, and I can re-output them whenever I want to. So why wouldn't I just do that? And I think in today's world, like, that's an okay reality to keep thinking you can just keep exporting out of InDesign. But I think, in the future, we're going to end up in a place where that's going to feel hampered, right? Like, I was talking about the multiple outputs. And today, like, InDesign only does one EPUB. And it does in one EPUB 3, and you just hope that it works on your Nook. You hope that it's not including like special code that's going to break on an old device. You could script your way out of those problems if you wanted to, but now you're just adding sort of layers of complexity on a system that you don't even own. And yeah, I mean, I think that there's some other issues about InDesign. Oh yeah, so I should have said this, I should have put this up before. If you really love InDesign, you're gonna come find me after this, and you're gonna put me in the corner, I think. Anyway, so my biggest concern with InDesign, and this is sort of comes out of these other things, which is that like data isn't really structured in InDesign. It's meant as a GUI. It's meant as a user interface where you're placing images exactly where you want them to go, but you're not necessarily saying like, hey, this is a like sub-level header, right? Like, how often, like, I don't know about you, but like I do deal with InDesign a lot. We do a lot of InDesign to Creativist stuff. And every once in a while, I'll get a file from like a book publisher or a magazine, and this is what their style panel looks like. And I mean, or maybe there's Word stuff in there, right? Like they imported this file from Word, and like, so I mean, this is the problem with something like InDesign, is that it can be semantic if you make it. But if you don't force it into some sort of semantic or structured data, as far as InDesign is concerned, it still looks great. It can still be output to a PDF, but it doesn't always conform to any sort of data, right? And I mean, I think that that's also a nature of print books, right? So this is an example of a book that I worked on, and the basic question is like, how does that sidebar relate to this content? Like, they're on the same page, but they don't necessarily have to relate to each other. Where would this go if I were thinking about this book as like a linear scroll? Like, where would this thing fit in? It could fit in right before that new paragraph, but maybe that ruins the text flow. So it's like a great thing where, like, InDesign allows you to create these great looking books. And there's probably a ton of this book was actually very nicely structured. I don't want to say that that was one of the bad examples. But again, there's questions of when you work with a WYSIWYG and like a system where you're purely thinking visually, you're not necessarily thinking about how those data pieces work. So I don't actually know how this would have exported out of an EPUB 3. Maybe it would have just put this all in a side. If it were smart enough to know that all those pieces belong together. Maybe it just dumped out a bunch of images. So again, we've got these things where, like, because these things weren't structured to begin with, we don't know how to treat them. So long term, I think that InDesign is just another output out of a CMS. So if we're outputting a web version, app version, various flavors of EPUB, outputting a PDF, we should figure out a way to just export it out as an InDesign file as well. That would give a print designer the ability to create, like, a very beautiful layout. And the data was originally structured, but now they can sort of play with it a little bit as they want to create a visual structure. I've actually experimented with this a little bit, and if there are any great scripters out there, I'd love to talk to you more. At Atavist, we actually do a system in the reverse where we go through an InDesign file and generate a JSON markup that we can then import into our system. But I've actually played with the opposite, and it's not the easiest thing to do. But I think long term, like that's really what I think would be the best solution. All right, so now I've just talked a little bit about what I think like the short-term future is of these ebooks and how a CMS like helps sort of like give them some life. But I think the best thing about all of us being here is that we can think about what this like API system of an ebook looks like. We can think about what this AI version of a book looks like. I think there's lots of great like little Twitter bots that are doing cool things with text, and we could certainly see a way in which that's maybe the next level of publishing, not in any like real full way, but like in a fun way, which I think is also something that we can do more of with publishing. This is something that I'm constantly thinking about. Like, we build stuff at Atavist, and then we say, oh, but what would be really great is if we could actually get a system where this would work on the Apple Watch, like where we're displaying one word like every 5 seconds on your phone or on your wrist. Like, totally stupid ideas, but they're fun to think about, and they're fun to think about how you would structure them. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is what I'm really excited about, and I hope some of you will come up and tell me about your next great idea at the break. Thank you, guys.